Let's start by checking your answers for the Compromise of 1850 and then adding a little bit to that if necessary. All right, so if you look at your bullet points for the Compromise of 1850, one I spotted you in class yesterday was that the Compromise of 1850 brings California into the Union as a free state. So that's going to be a big score for the northern states that they would have a massive new state on the free state side. What do the southern states get out of that compromise? Um, some regions in the areas that are taken from Mexico are going to be allowed to choose whether or not they are going to have slavery. So that should be one of your bullet points. Um, the big score for the South in their argument, what they are trying to get out of this, is a new fugitive slave law. And what's different about the new fugitive slave law is that there is no way for anybody that is accused of being a fugitive slave to contest that in a court of law. And why that is so controversial in the North is that it essentially turns all Northern authorities into slave hunters. One of the things that I'll come back to in our notes as we look at this is that largely the people of the North kind of shrugged their shoulders about slavery because it was always somebody else's problem somewhere else. But the fugitive slave law starts to change that situation. And so I guess the best way to describe the Compromise of 1850 as a cause of the Civil War is it's a classic example of when you try and make everybody happy, you're going to make nobody happy. Okay, let's check your answer for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written in 1852. It was written as a form of protest against the fugitive slave law, which was part of the Compromise of 1850. And its author is this woman right here, Harriet Beecher Stowe. If this gives you any idea of how important she is in this equation, when Abraham Lincoln got a chance to meet Harriet Beecher Stowe later on during the Civil War, he is reported to have said to her when he met her, "So this is the little lady that started the Great War." What does he mean by that? What's Harriet Beecher Stowe's role in this? Again, as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was not a book at first, it actually came out as a serial, meaning that you bought it essentially a chapter at a time. It was a way for them to get people to come back and buy the magazine month to month. Um, by going one chapter at a time. And if you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you can see that that's what is in there because pretty much every chapter ends with a cliffhanger. So they're trying to get you to come back and buy the next one. Um, the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin is a story of some runaway slaves that are trying to escape to the north. Um, but at the same time, there's Uncle Tom, who was somebody that those runaway slaves knew once upon a time, um, who is a perfect slave from the slave owner's point of view. Uncle Tom only does exactly what he is supposed to do, what his owner tells him to do, until the end of the book. He is given an order to beat one of his fellow slaves, and he refuses to do it. And because of that, Tom is then beaten to death. So the story there is that no matter what a slave does in the slave society, it's going to end very, very badly for them. Um, the importance of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the number 2 best-selling book of the entire century, behind only the Bible, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. The importance of that is I had a social history of the United States class at Mizzou, and my professor told me at that time in the United States, the average person was born and lived their entire life and died within 20 miles of where they were born. And so you never saw anything more than a 20-mile circle around your place of birth. That would describe the majority of Americans at that time. So that means people that were north of the Ohio River, where free states, had never actually seen a slave, had never seen the slavery system. they might know that they know it exists, but it might as well be on the other side of the world for them. They've had no contact with it. So they might have kind of a philosophical idea that it's a terrible thing, but it really, in a lot of their minds, was somebody else's problem somewhere else. What do you think about slavery? It sounds bad, but a lot of times we oversimplify it in our heads that the people of the North were like opposed to slavery, and the people of the South were in favor of slavery. And by and large, that's true for the people of the South. Even if they weren't a slave owner at one point, they're aspiring to become a slave owner. But the people of the North, when we say they were opposed to slavery, that's probably not a very accurate description. The vast majority of people of the North had kind of whatever. That was their attitude. It was somebody else's problem somewhere else. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe changes that. It takes the slavery story and drops it right on your front door. Now, speaking to you guys that are sophomores here, the closest equivalent that I can think of, the analogy that I've always drawn for you is, if you remember in your freshman world history class, you almost assuredly watched Schindler's List, and you have studied the Holocaust many times as a student, and after a while you kind of get numb to the numbers. You hear that 6 million Jews, 6 million other people, 12 million people total killed by the Holocaust. And as horrific as that number is, it after a while just becomes a number. And then you watch something like Schindler's List, and you suddenly realize every one of those numbers was somebody that just was trying to stay alive. Every one of those 12 million was somebody's son or daughter that was just trying to make it through the day and live to see another day. And that's what Harriet Beecher Stowe does with slavery. She puts a face on it, and she makes a connection that people of the North didn't have prior to this. Now, obviously, this doesn't lead to the outbreak of the war. This is published in 1852, so the war is going to be 9 years into the future. But no longer could the people of the North claim that this was something that I don't know about, and this is somebody else's problem somewhere else, whatever. That has changed because of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, time for the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the birth of the Republican Party. The person at the center of the Kansas-Nebraska Act story is this gentleman right here. That is Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois. The little giant, 5'4" tall. You might know the name Stephen Douglas already. He is famous for having debated Abraham Lincoln for the position of senator from Illinois in 1858, an election that indirectly Stephen Douglas is going to win. Abraham Lincoln does not become senator from Illinois in 1858. Stephen Douglas wins re-election. So I'm getting to the end of this before I get to the start. It's kind of interesting to think about Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln on the same platform debating one another. Lincoln, who is 6'5" in that neighborhood, and Douglas, who is 5'4". Lincoln is more than a foot taller than Stephen Douglas, but at that point in history, Douglas is the one with all the power. Stephen Douglas is a senator from Illinois, but like a lot of senators, the job that he really wants to have is President of the United States. So that's all part of this story as well. So there's a lot of things that he's trying to do with this Kansas-Nebraska Act. One of the things that he's trying to do is make sure that he maintains his position as senator from Illinois. He's up for re-election in 1858. This bill is going to be pushed through Congress in 1854. So he's got to try and do a couple of things with this. The question at that point was, where is the railroad going to go across the country? Railroads were fast becoming the new primary source in the new age, cutting edge form of transportation across the country. So there were a lot of different questions about where will this transcontinental railroad go across the country? Will it go down south? There were a lot of people that wanted it to go across the southern United States and go into California. There was a school of thought that it should go right through the middle. The trick here is that there's no bridge going to be built across the Mississippi River at St. Louis for a long time. And this is actually where St. Louis starts to lose its grip as one of the biggest cities in the country. When the trains became more important than the riverboats, St. Louis gets passed up by Chicago. And that's going to be the center of this story. Stephen Douglas wants that transcontinental railroad to pull right into Chicago here because he knows that that'll be good for his reelection chances. That'll be good for the state of Illinois. He's looking out for the interests of the state of Illinois here. So the solution to the question of where should the transcontinental railroad go across is, if you want it to go through Chicago, you're going to need people out here. And the best way to get people to start moving out there is to start organizing this into territories. So that's what the Kansas-Nebraska Act is designed to do. It's going to form Kansas and Nebraska into territories, and it's with the hope of them eventually becoming states. Well, if you look at the old Missouri Compromise line, Kansas and Nebraska are both north of the Missouri Compromise line. So when they come into the Union, they are going to be free states. People in the southern states are starting to get worried about the growing power of the northern states. They're not too excited about two more free states coming into the Union. Stephen Douglas, as a Democrat, knows that he's going to need Southern support if he's going to run for president in 1860. And he's also going to need Southern support to get this bill passed. So here's what he throws out there. Why don't we just take the Missouri Compromise and kind of throw it aside and let the people of Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves whether or not they're going to be slavery free? He calls that popular sovereignty. They're going to get the vote on the question of slavery themselves. Now, to Stephen Douglas, this is kind of a hollow promise. He doesn't understand when the people of the North are outraged by this. They see this as a sellout of the Missouri Compromise. That line that established that anything north of 3630 was going to be free territory. In Douglas's mind, he could promise this, that there would be votes there, this popular sovereignty, to decide whether or not Kansas and Nebraska are going to be slavery free, but it's almost a given that they're going to vote to be free states, because the kinds of crops that you would use slaves to grow do not do well in Kansas and Nebraska. You're not going to grow cotton in Kansas and Nebraska. So he has this feeling, I'm throwing them a bone to get their support for the law and hopefully to get support from Southern voters in the 1860 presidential election, when he figures that he's going to run for president. And so he sees this as a win-win. But this is going to so anger the people of the North that he has taken the Missouri Compromise, which they saw as the solution to the slavery question in this part of the country, and throw it in the trash can. The anger over that is going to lead to the formation of the Republican Party. For more than a decade, there had really only been one political party in this country. Andrew Jackson was so overwhelmingly popular that the Democratic Party had pretty much crushed all of its opposition. There was a party that was formed called the Whigs, and really the only thing that combined the Whigs together was that they were all opposed to Andrew Jackson, which was a unifying force while Jackson was president. But once Jackson's dead and gone, what do you have in common? And so that's going to change with the Republican Party's formation. The Republican Party is formed as the party that was opposed to slavery's expansion, to limit the possibility of slavery being, instituted in Kansas and Nebraska. And so the Republican Party is going to go from being non-existent in 1854, as any kind of real political force here, to electing the president of the United States in 1860. Lincoln was a Republican. And so the Republican Party owes its existence to the passage of and the anger coming out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, check your bullet points and what you've got for Bleeding Kansas and add any of this if you're missing it. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, what Stephen Douglas could not have foreseen, or maybe should have foreseen, was that those elections that were going to occur would not be necessarily something that everybody involved is just going to allow to happen peacefully. Both sides, both the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces, are going to send people into Kansas to do everything they can to swing the election towards their way of thinking. Harriet Beecher Stowe has her father sends immigrants into Kansas carrying what are known as Beecher's Bibles, which were rifles. The Beecher's Bibles were there. These people came ready to fight to oppose slavery. And the people that they're going to end up fighting against are from Missouri, people that are just across the border that are pro-slave owner, that realize that this is an opportunity to expand slave territory into Kansas. And they see that as a way to help protect the future of their slave ownership. And so you have people flooding into Kansas on both sides of the slavery debate that are armed and ready to fight over that issue. And not surprisingly, they are going to fight. And the result then is Bleeding Kansas. What you're looking at there is a painting of John Brown, who is an anti-slavery crusader, a representative of the anti-slavery forces that decides that he is going to fight the fight against slavery in Kansas. He and his sons go into a pro-slavery settlement at Potawatomi Creek, Kansas. And they find some pro-slavery settlers and they hack them to death with broadswords. And that's one example of the violence that occurs in Kansas. So we never point at Bleeding Kansas as the beginning of the Civil War. People always point to the first shots that are fired at Fort Sumter because that's where the war really begins in earnest. But the fighting and the killing over the question of slavery is going to rage back and forth across the Missouri-Kansas border starting in the mid-1850s, and that is going to extend all the way through the Civil War, 1865. And depending on how you look at some of like the actions of like the James Boys, this could be a fight that actually lasts for another 10 or 15 years after the Civil War, where people from Missouri and Kansas are going to be killing each other over the question of slavery for decades. It's not an accident that the University of Missouri's number one rival is the University of Kansas. There is history to that. That rivalry does not come from sports alone. It comes from a time when the people of Missouri and Kansas killed each other. Okay, let's double check our answers for Bleeding Sumner. The Sumner in Bleeding Sumner is Charles Sumner, who's senator from Massachusetts. He had given a speech on the floor of the Senate that was critical of Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Andrew Butler's cousin, Preston Brooks, took offense to this and decided that he was going to take care of Charles Sumner to settle a score. And so he decides to go into the Senate chamber carrying this cane right here. It was broken, but they put it back together. So it's that cane head right there that hit Charles Sumner over the head and proceeded to nearly beat Charles Sumner to death with his cane as Sumner was in the Senate chamber. Again, he hit him so hard that he broke the cane. Sumner is so physically damaged by this that he's actually not going to be able to serve in the Senate for 3 full years after this beating. The people of Massachusetts reelected Sumner and left his seat open to remind everybody of the South what they had done to Charles Sumner. By contrast, how did Southerners respond to this? When they found out that the cane was broken, people sent new canes to Preston Brooks. So he would have a cane. One of them was engraved, "Hit him again." So To the people of the South, Preston Brooks was a hero. To the people of the North, this is an act of domestic terrorism. You have a member of the House of Representatives charging into the Senate and nearly beating a senator to death on the floor of the Senate. Every now and again, I hear people talk about politics these days are like the nastiest it's ever been. That is just not the case. As a result of what happened to Charles Sumner, people started showing up to work in Congress armed. We don't see that today, but people were coming to Congress ready for a fight. Next on our list of reasons or causes of the Civil War is the Dred Scott decision. It's a picture of Dred Scott. Dred was a Missouri slave, and he was owned by a U.S. Army doctor who was stationed here at St. Louis. And at one point in the doctor's Army service, he was stationed in Northern Territories. He was stationed in Wisconsin Territory, which was a free territory. There was no slavery there. And that's going to become the foundation of Dred Scott's case. He's going to eventually sue for his freedom on the grounds that while he was in Wisconsin in a free area, that he was no longer a slave. And once you're free, you are free. That was the foundation of his decision. It's quite simple, but quite logical reasoning. So he sued for his freedom, and the case began here in St. Louis. If you go to the old courthouse in downtown St. Louis, there's quite a bit of information there about it, including some of the original paperwork that was filed to begin this case. So if you're looking for a place to go for self-sign points, the old courthouse downtown is a good place to go. The case takes a while, like any case, to wind its way through the legal system, and it takes nearly 10 years for it to get to the Supreme Court. In 1857, the Supreme Court is ready to issue their decision. And the decision that is authored by Roger Taney, that's Taney. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right here, press pause on this video, open a Google tab, and do an image search for Roger Taney. Do it right now. All right, you back? He is one of the ugliest people I've ever seen, and I can say that because his decision is some of the ugliest thinking that you can see, and it's in line with what slave owners thought. The decision was this: that Dred Scott was not free, and he had no right to sue. That in the eyes of the court, he was a piece of property. It would be no different than one of the plows of a farmer suing for its freedom as a piece of property. Now, the court could have just ended right there and dismissed the case, but remember, the Supreme Court is not interested in just one person's case. It's looking at the whole system. And so Roger Taney takes it upon himself to try and solve the slavery debate, the slavery question for the whole country. And so they go farther with this decision. Not only do they say that Dred Scott is not free, that he's still a slave, they go farther and say that he, or rather any slave, is property wherever they are taken into any territory. So the thought is that the Fifth Amendment protects the slave owner's right to property no matter where they go. So in actuality, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, there is no such thing as free soil or free territory. A slave owner owns a slave in this state. He can go wherever he wants with it. The court also then goes on to say that Dred Scott can never be a citizen, that the Constitution is clearly designed for whites only. Now, I've read the whole Constitution. There's nothing in there about that, but it's the Supreme Court that says what the Constitution says, and so that's their decision. Roger Taney is trying to settle the slavery debate, and I guess in a certain way he does. This Dred Scott decision makes the Civil War all but inevitable because compromise at this point is over. And I guess that in the grand scheme of things, it's a good thing because this puts slavery on the path to destruction. But the South feels like they no longer need to compromise, that the Supreme Court is completely on their side. And remember what I said about the power of the Supreme Court before the year started, that, or in our first unit of study, the Supreme Court's power is a sledgehammer. When they make a ruling, the only way to overturn that ruling is to amend the Constitution. And just to give you an idea of the power of the Dred Scott decision, the Civil War doesn't overturn it. It's actually going to be two constitutional amendments that are passed after the Civil War that are going to overturn the Dred Scott decision, the 13th and 14th Amendment. That's the staying power of a Supreme Court decision. So the South feels like they no longer need to compromise, that the Supreme Court is thoroughly on their side. And the North has gotten to a position where this suddenly makes slavery an issue all around them. On one of the prior slides, like Uncle Tom's Cabin slide, I told you that a lot of Northern attitudes about slavery is like, it's somebody else's problem somewhere else. Supreme Court has basically said here that slavery can be anywhere. And so this is something that is now potentially in their backyard. It makes them part of the system that they don't want to be part of. And just as a footnote, I went to a rights conference last year for school and met Lynn Jackson. That's a picture of me with Lynn Jackson. She is Dred and Harriet Scott's great great granddaughter, and she leads an institute that's named after Dred Scott now. Um, Dred Scott's buried here in St. Louis. I've been to his grave to pay my respects. He's at Calvary Cemetery up in northern St. Louis. So the Dred Scott decision has deep roots here in St. Louis. So if you ever get a chance, it's worth investigating that connection. This is the second time I've talked about John Brown in our Causes of the Civil War notes. If you think back to Bleeding Kansas, he was an anti-slavery crusader. John Brown saw himself as a tool of God here on earth in fighting slavery. He was a very religious man. That was the way he looked at it. Not successful in stopping slavery in Kansas, or rather not successful in bringing down the slavery system through his actions in Kansas. He decides to go bigger with his attack on slavery. And so in 1859, he comes up with a rather simple plan. He and his supporters, his sons and a few other supporters, decide that they're going to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, today West Virginia. An arsenal is where arms are stored, and so his plan is to raid the arsenal, grab weapons, disperse those weapons to the local slave plantations, and start a slave rebellion that will pick up steam as it goes throughout the South as they overthrow other slave plantations and gain more and more arms, that it will become this region-wide attack on slavery. That was the plan. Nothing about the plan goes to plan. He and his supporters are surrounded in one of the buildings there at the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And eventually, where they're holed up is raided by the Marines under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, who, if you know anything about the Civil War, he's going to be somebody that we study as the number one Confederate general, but at this time he's still part of the U.S. Army. And so Lee is key in capturing John Brown. Brown is pretty quickly sentenced to die. His last words were not spoken. He wrote a message that was then later read, where he predicted the Civil War. To paraphrase, he said, "The crimes of this land, the sins of this land can only be washed away with blood." And I guess he was pretty accurate with that. 600,000 people killed in the Civil War. One of the reasons why his actions are a cause of the Civil War, not just because of his actions, but because of the reaction to it in the two regions. To use modern terminology, the South sees him as a domestic terrorist, somebody that's trying to overthrow their way of life. The people of the North increasingly are starting to see actions of people like John Brown as heroic. And so the two sides are quite angry with one another in their disparate reactions to what John Brown has done. In 1859, the war is going to start in 1861. This is, we're getting really close connection now. The most immediate cause of the outbreak of Civil War, the thing that leads to the actual shooting to begin in April of 1861, is the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. There are four people running for president in 1860. You've got Stephen Douglas, you've got John Bell, you've got John Breckinridge, and you've got Abraham Lincoln. Breckinridge and Douglas are both Democrats. What happened was the Democrats got together in convention and nominated Stephen Douglas, which the Southern representatives of the Democratic Party were not happy with, because Douglas was still talking about popular sovereignty, that idea that he put forward in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But by that point, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the South with the Dred Scott case. And so they see somebody like Douglas as a sellout to their position. So Southern Democrats are not interested in supporting Stephen Douglas in the election of 1860. So they break away and they go and have their own convention. Southern Democrats nominate one of their own, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, a slave owner, for president. And then there's a third political party that doesn't stick around, the Constitutional Union Party, they nominate Bell, and basically their position is, we'll just figure it out, but let's stay together as a country and simplify things. So you've got those three, and then you've got Abraham Lincoln, a representative of the essentially brand new Republican Party. Lincoln is a relative unknown at this point, and that's one of the reasons why he got the Republican nomination. A lot of other famous Republicans, people within the party, had axes to grind with them. So he gets the nomination largely because nobody in the party really dislikes him. Plus, he had gained a lot of national fame in his debates against Stephen Douglas in 1858, and then he had gone on a speaking tour and talked about how slavery was tearing the country apart. The House Divided speech. If you're not familiar with that one, you can look that one up, but that's something you should have at least heard of in 8th grade. So those four are running for president. Now, the key here is the Electoral College system. Remember, this is something we looked at in the first week of school. We don't just vote for the president by counting up all the votes and whoever has the most votes wins. The presidential election is actually a state-by-state election. You get the most states votes here in the state of Missouri, then you get all of Missouri's Electoral College votes. And to become president of the United States, you need a majority of Electoral College votes, not the majority or a plurality of the votes of the people. You have to win states. And so if you look at our bar graph breakdown here, there are 60% of the American people that vote for somebody other than Abraham Lincoln. He only gets 40% of the American people to vote for him. 60% vote for somebody else. But if you look, he gets more than each one of them. So he wins northern state after northern state, outpolling Douglas, and obviously Breckinridge is not going to get much support up north, and Bell with this brand new party is not going to get a whole lot of support. So Lincoln wins northern state after northern state. The key here to note is that Lincoln doesn't get any votes in the South. In a majority of the southern states, he doesn't even get a single person to vote for him, not even somebody as a joke, as a goof, writes his name on a ballot anywhere. He gets no Southern Electoral College votes, and in many southern states, no person votes for him. And the end result is that the people of the South, the southern states, feel like they don't have any power on the national level anymore, that this person has been elected without any support from their region. that they are going to be completely controlled by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party was the anti-slavery party. It was the party opposed to slavery's expansion, and people in the Republican Party are not just opposed to the expansion of slavery, but they're anti-slavery representatives by and large. And so the southern states decide, if we're going to protect slavery and they've just elected a president without any input from us, we got to go. And so it is a little bit more than a month after Lincoln wins the election of 1860 that South Carolina decides to secede from the Union. That's in December of 1865, or excuse me, 1860. And so they're out, and that starts a whole cascade of other southern states doing the same, leaving the Union. And the stage is set for the war to break out.